Welcome to my woodworking journey. This is part 1. Settle back and listen to my journey over many years.
I was the youngest of 5 kids, 2 girls and 3 boys. Dad was a carpet cutter. Mum stayed at home and held the family together. This was in the early 60s, around 1966. I was 13 years old and a poor student at school and didn't like it at all, but I did like making things. We were poor, so if you wanted something, you either had to mow your neighbor's lawn and do other odd jobs to get the cash or make it yourself. This was the first time I had used any woodworking tools. I was going to make a skateboard. I found a piece of hardwood, about 2 feet by 8 inches, 3/4 thick. Perfect. I made a skateboard deck. My mate had a store-bought skateboard, and I was so jealous. I had some old roller skates which I was going to use for the wheels. I traced my mate's skateboard deck onto the piece of hardwood, and now I had to cut it out. My mate's deck had curves in it, and all I had was an old handsaw of my dad's. Blunt as, I drew straight lines in between the ends of the curves, put the timber in the metal vise, and started sawing. Up until then, as a 13-year-old, I had never worked up a sweat. But bloody hell, this is hard work. Anyway, between us, we had it done in about half an hour. A bit of sanding on the edges and it looked great. We cut the soles off the roller skates with the wheels on them and screwed them to the new deck. After a few hours, I had a skateboard. It worked great in a straight line, but would not turn. That was my first project in woodworking, and I haven't stopped since. Australia in the 60s, you had 2 different school systems. If you wanted to go to university or work in an office, you went to high school. If you wanted to have a trade or work with your hands, you went to a technical school. My 2 older brothers went to a technical school, so I went there too. It was a Catholic school, ran by the Christian Brothers. All I can say about them is that they were not very Christian. I hated school and the teachers, and the only class I looked forward to was woodworking, where I learned the basics of how to use a hand plane, saw a straight line, and how to construct a house frame. But after 3 years I left there, disillusioned with school. I looked forward to woodworking class. I was 15 years old, could barely read and write, but wasn't bad at maths. I had no idea what I wanted to do. Back then, there were no guidance counselors. All you had were your mates. All Mum and Dad said was to try and get an apprenticeship. But what sort? I did the entrance exam to be a linesman for the electricity company, but didn't make it. My mate got a trailer apprenticeship as a cabinet maker. That sounded great, and I decided to do that too. As I already liked woodwork, I had no idea what hard work was like. I thought it would be like school where you had all the time in the world to finish your project. Have 20 minutes for morning tea, 1 hour for lunch, knock off at 3:30 p.m. I could do that. Boy, was I dreaming. My first job was in a furniture factory. The boss promised me all sorts of things, so I was excited to start. On the first day, they gave me some sandpaper, and I came face to face with about 100 chairs. Oh crap. The chairs had their first coat of lacquer applied, and now had to be sanded smooth, ready for another coat. I worked with another apprentice who was a second year. I learnt a lot that first day. First, I learnt it was head down, ass up. You're here to work. So, walk I did. By the time lunch came around, my back hurt. I had sanded my fingers raw and only got half an hour for lunch, not an hour. That afternoon was the same as the morning. Hard work. I went home that night battered and bruised with a lot to think about. The next day, I fronted work again, and now I knew what to expect. I had sanded my fingers raw. We had finished sanding the chairs, and I was handed a broom for clean-up duties for the rest of the day. The factory was big, about 100 workers, so cleaning up gave me the chance to look around. As a semi-mass production company, I said to myself, there must be better cabinet shops than this around. At the end of the day, I decided to quit but was too scared to tell the boss, so I didn't show up the next day. I told Mum and Dad went around to talk to the boss and pick up my wages. The average wage for a qualified cabinet maker in 1968 was about $70 per week. Dad picked up $10 for me, so $5 a day. My mate, Frank, got an apprenticeship in a much better furniture factory where they made domestic and office furniture. It was about 6 miles from my home, so Frank's dad drove him every morning. If I managed to get a job there, I could tag along. So off I went to see the boss. It was a family-owned business, ran by the older son, who was a nice guy, but a businessman nevertheless. I wanted a cabinet-making apprenticeship, but they had known, as they had already hired Frank and another first-year apprentice. But he did have a wood machining apprenticeship available. Looking back, I think he talked me into taking on the wood machining apprenticeship. He said that I would work in the cabinet shop as well. I was 15, so it didn't take much persuasion to get me to do what he wanted. I had an apprenticeship. I still wanted to be a cabinet maker, so I enrolled in night school to do my trade course in cabinet making, which was 2 nights a week. I also went to wood machining school 1 day a week. I loved the schooling aspect of both wood machining and cabinet making. How is it that I was so bad at regular school but loved trade school? I'm just glad I had found my calling. In my first year as an apprentice, I was not allowed to use any dangerous machines like shapers, crosscut saw, and other equipment. I spent half my time in the machine shop and the rest in the cabinet shop. It was still hard work, but I fitted it in quite well. After about 6 months, they put me in charge of the timer yard. The firm had 2 factories, about 200 yards apart. The machine and cabinet shop were in the old building. It was double-storied, with the machine shop on the bottom and the cabinet shop on the top floor. There was a small lift to get the components up to the cabinet shop, and a large timber slide about 12 feet wide to get the furniture down to the loading bay. The second factory was the finishing factory, as well as a dispatch department. The timbers yard was on the side of that building. I was in charge of the timber yard. My job in the mornings was to pick out the timber that they were going to need for the next day. I learnt a lot about grading and how to work around imperfections in the timber. I used white chalk to show the machinists where to cut the timber to get the best out of it. In the 60s, there were a lot of great timbers around that you can't get now. For example, Australian black beam, which looks a lot like wenge. Most of the office furniture was made out of it, very dark and drab like most offices around that time. The domestic furniture was mainly made of teak or Australian blackwood, which is not black at all. You can see throughout the book that I have used it in a few of my boxes. I love working with blackwood, and you can still obtain it in limited quantities. Some of the other timbers we used that are hard to find now include silver ash and ramen, just to name a few. They gave me an old First World War gun cart with the gun removed, of course, to wheel the timber up to the machine shop that was needed for the next day. In between the 2 factories, there was a group of single-fronted houses. I must have looked funny wheeling this cart full of timber up the footpath every day. It was noisy, too, as it had iron wheels. But back then, that's how it was done. I think it was around that time in the 60s where everything was changing. A lot of old-timers in the shop were about to retire. Most of them had served in World War II or deemed essential workers as they fitted out war ships from this factory. Some of the old jigs for the ships were still kept in the old shed. They had some great stories to tell, but times were changing. The machine shop had a lot of big old machines that were very dangerous. Most of the guards were missing, and the old guys didn't care. I was crapping myself at some of the things we used to do, especially with the shaper and its big exposed cutters. It didn't help that Duncan, the head shaper operator, had only 3 fingers on one hand and 4 fingers on the other. I only had one serious accident in my time there. I was using the bandsaw when I slipped and cut the tendon in my little finger. That was the only time I touched a spinning blade. Over the next 4 years, I worked hard at machining and cabinet making. The furniture industry had changed mainly for the better, and a lot of the old guys retired. I miss the stories that they used to tell about the old days.
Thanks for listening to my woodworking journey. Keep an eye out for the next installment of my story. Please subscribe and see you soon.